Caroline, hi, really nice to see you again, and thank you very much for agreeing to do this. We first met just after you'd been selected to stand as an MEP in the South West in 2019. Can you tell us a bit about your career up to that time, both professionally and politically, and why you made the decision to stand?
Yes, so I started off as a journalist. I worked for Reuters news agency straight from university. I joined their graduate trainee scheme back in 1991. So I spent 10 years working as a correspondent, which kind of took me all over Europe. I did some time in Amsterdam and Dublin and Germany, but I also spent a long time in the Balkans. So I was sort of part of a rolling operation, which we ran out of Belgrade during the war. I was never actually in Bosnia itself, but I was in Belgrade on and off for a couple of years, sort of editing all the news that was coming out of Bosnia. And then after the war finished, I was given the job of running the bureau in Zagreb in Croatia. So I went there for 2 years, just post-war, and that job was about sort of straightening them out, really, bringing them on shore, making them pay tax, ending their habit of, thousands of Deutschmarks of expenses pouring through the office every week. So I wasn't hugely popular, but it was good training, and it was very interesting. And I was in Bosnia when U2 came and did their big concert in Sarajevo, which was the first concert there for many, many, many years. It was huge. And I was there when Princess Diana came on her mine field trip just before she died. And I think Bill Clinton came as well. So it was a really exciting time. And then I left Reuters and I went to work for Just Giving when they were launching their online fundraising platform. So it was a very small team when I joined, and I was there for a few years. And then while I was at Just Giving, I had 2 small children. The reason I left Reuters really was because I had a baby and I couldn't travel very much, and the job became a lot less interesting sitting on a desk in London. But when our second daughter was very small, my husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And a year later, he died when the girls was 1 and 3. So the career kind of took a bit of a back seat, really. And I moved to Devon in 2007 and worked part-time as a journalist, worked for the Western Morning News, did some editing, did quite a lot of freelance editing. So I was on my own with the kids for about 9 years. So I basically had to do work that I could do in the middle of the night, really, when they were asleep, and a few hours when they were at school. So I did that. And then so long story short, I did lots of different things. I ran a business in Totnes. 5 years later, I kind of was knackered and broke and had to wrap that up, and worked for a couple of charities. But then, so the referendum happened, and I hadn't really been involved. I hadn't been involved at all in campaigning for Stronger In. But my dad, who is now 80, had been out every single day. I mean, for weeks and weeks, Dad was out there every day. He was handing out leaflets, he was doing street stalls, he was knocking on doors. And I live in Totnes, so tiny little bubble of Remain in this sort of sea of leave. And I was so consumed with trying to stop my business going down the pan that I just kind of was a bit blinkered about what was happening outside of our little Remain bubble. So massive shock when the results came in, and I just thought, it's not good enough to just shout at the television. I've got to step up and I've got to get active. And, if people like my dad can do it, then I should really be doing it as well. And I could have done more, and I should have done more, and I didn't. So I joined the Liberal Democrats the day after the election, the referendum. And as tends to happen in the Liberal Democrats, as some of you will know, if you show an ounce of enthusiasm or energy, or you're under 75, you're immediately co-opted into doing 20 different jobs. So it wasn't long before I was a paper candidate for the next set of county council elections in 2017. Did atrociously badly. I got about 5% of the vote against the Tory leader of the council. But then I ended up getting on the approved list, and I stood in the general election in 2017 in a no hope seat as a kind of paper candidate, but I really enjoyed it. It was a great experience. And then last year we got this email which said, oh, it looks like we're going to have these European elections that we weren't expecting to have, and we're going to need some candidates. And I happened to be, let's just say, sort of between jobs. So I had a 2-minute chat with my husband, and he said, well, you might as well apply. You've got nothing to lose. You've not got a job, have you? So I did. And, you know, all that experience, I think, of working in Europe, and I have spoken 5 languages. I mean, it's kind of on my CV. I don't speak 5 languages now. I speak fluent French. The rest are very rusty, but I had relevant experience. And I think, yeah, it was, yeah, that was it really. Put my name on the, you know, put my thing in, and ended up top of the list really, which was absolutely astonishing. And I couldn't quite believe it, but yeah, that's how I got there. So it was serendipity and luck and chance and all those things.
Fantastic. Well, as a Lib Dem, I was actually absolutely delighted when you were elected, and I followed your activities on social media once you went to Brussels. You seem to really throw yourself into the role, and you covered a huge amount of ground in a short time. So I've got a few questions about the time that you spent as an MEP.
Yeah.
And the first one, the obvious one really, is did you find Brussels was run by unelected bureaucrats, as we're all told that it is?
So I'd be lying if I didn't say there wasn't a huge amount of bureaucracy in Brussels. I mean, it was astonishing. You know, getting anything done required, they still required paper forms with handwritten signatures, usually in triplicate, for anything. So anything to do with a member of staff who worked in the UK, we had to have paper forms delivered to Brussels. So the first sort of 3 months was spent with my office manager at home, sending bits of paper backwards and forwards. I mean, it really did beg a belief. They were way behind the curve with all of that. So there was a huge amount of bureaucracy, but no, I didn't feel like it was run by bureaucrats. I felt like the Parliament was very much a Parliament of the MEPs, and you know, we ran our committees ourselves, and we did the work, and we worked with each other. We all had our own office. So I had 2 assistants in Brussels who were fantastic. I had a guy from Manchester called Connor, and a young woman from Sweden called Stina, and they were just amazing. And the assistants all spoke to, all knew each other. So, you know, if you wanted to kind of have a chat with a Spanish MEP, then somebody's assistant would know somebody who worked in that office. You know, that's kind of how things got done, really. They all drank together, they partied together. There was a lot of networking amongst the assistants, which was very, very helpful. And no, I mean, no, I didn't feel it was run by bureaucrats at all.
Okay. How did you feel the democratic processes worked in the proportional system they have there? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of that compared with the British political system?
So I would say that things were quite slow. And, you know, I've never worked in Westminster, so I don't know how easy or difficult it is to make things happen in Westminster. But, you know, if you take the committee work, for example, which is where the kind of the real work happens, you know, not in the plenary, that's just where you go and sit and do this sort of showboating speeches and pass votes. But the actual work goes on behind the scenes in Brussels. So, you know, the Commission would give us a piece of legislation. One of the things I worked on was something to do with pesticides in the Environment Committee, which I was on. There are 83 people on that Environment Committee. So, you know, it's massive. And there were 11 people on that committee just from Renew Europe, which was the Liberal group we were part of. So the first thing we would do is the 11 of us would sit down together, and we would try and work out where we stood on whatever this piece of legislation was. And, you know, sometimes that in itself was quite difficult, because as you can imagine, 11 Liberals in a room, you've got 12 opinions, and they can be quite diverse. And, you know, you have people from north and south and east and west, and people with quite entrenched opinions. So we had a guy from Slovakia who had been a big Greenpeace activist. But we also had a Dutch farmer who had quite a mechanized modern farm in Holland. So, you know, you had really different opinions. So we had to come up with our stance for the Renew Europe stance, and then we would have to get together with all the other groups. So we would have a coordinator who represented us, and he would get together with the coordinator of the Socialists and Democrats and the EPP and the Greens. And then they would have long meetings. I mean, sometimes they went right through the night so that they could try and come up with a form of words for an amendment, or, you know, sort of trying to adjust the policy so that they could come up with something that was good enough to get a majority in the House, so that when it went to the plenary chamber, enough people would vote for it to get passed. So there was an awful lot of backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And it felt really clunky, but it is quite difficult for me to comment in a way, because we were elected in May and the new commission took quite a long time to settle. So it was really not agreed until November. And then obviously the election had been called and we weren't really present. I mean, most of late November, we were all at home here doing what we could. So, you know, I wasn't really there for much active legislative stuff. I think it was really thorough. That was the impression I got, that everything was really debated very, very thoroughly. And you do end up with kind of compromises. You end up with policies that are not as radical as some people would like, but occasionally something will slip through that's maybe a bit more radical than people expect. I know that they've just increased the I've forgotten, sorry, I've got a brain freeze. They've gone up to 65%. Is it for the percentage of energy that has to be from renewable sources by a certain date or something? It was 55 and they pushed it to 60. I think they've now pushed it to 65. So that has gone much further than people expected. So it does happen, but that's quite rare.
Okay, yeah, it does sound like quite different from the UK, because I often get the impression in the UK that an awful lot of MPs don't even know what they're voting for. They just vote as they're told and they don't really scrutinise things. So that does sound more thorough.
So don't be fooled that all the MEPs know what they're voting for all the time. Last week, they voted on something like 1,400 amendments on the Agri Bill. So what happens is you get a printed form, a printed sheet with the votes, and each group, so the Greens, the Labour group, the Renew Europe group, will get a voting list which has been agreed in the group. And you kind of trust your colleagues on the Agri committee that they have gone through all 1,400 amendments. But they will literally spend hours in the chamber and they will vote 1,400 times. You don't know what you're voting on.
No, but I guess some people do. There are people who have gone down to that level of scrutiny and have really...
Yeah, some of them have. But if there's anything contentious or you know, any big amendment which it could, you know, is tricky, it will have been discussed in the group, but most of it is just, you just vote the way you're told to vote.
Okay. And what were your proudest achievements from the time you spent there and your greatest disappointments?
So for me personally, my proudest achievement was being elected leader of the group in November when Catherine stood down. I was really, really chuffed. And yeah, that was a really big moment. I was also very proud of the fact that I managed to make my last speech in the chamber without crying, because I had been very wobbly and I was not looking forward to it. But I had to go first because I was leader of the group. So I was terrified, actually. Yeah, and I was proud of what all of us did. I was proud of the 16 of us. I think we were a really great group. We didn't know each other before we went in, and we bonded really, really quickly. And we were a really diverse group of people. We were a funny bunch, really, but all ages, all colours, men, women, you know, but we just got on really, really well and worked really well together as a team. Everyone had their strengths and everybody used each other's strengths. You know, we did really well. Fiona's son, Ali, was with us as our press and comms guy. He was absolutely brilliant and just so full of energy. And we had a great team. It was, yeah, I was just proud of everything, really.
And the disappointment, greatest disappointment?
Well, of course, the greatest disappointment was that I couldn't stay. You know, we were doing really important work, and we felt like we were doing good work. It was just utterly heartbreaking, really. And, you know, I know Brexit was heartbreaking for everyone, but I think for us, there was just such a huge personal level to it as well. You know, losing this job that we all just absolutely loved, and it was so exciting and so much fun. And to be told that it was over, you know, was yeah, that was really tough.
Yeah. Okay, can you just summarise very quickly what you think Britain has lost in leaving the EU? And given where we are there any benefits?
What have we lost? We could be here all night. I think the main thing we've lost is just being a member of the club. I think it's been so badly portrayed here. It's been so badly sort of demonized as something that it's just not. I mean, you know, the European Union, God knows it is really not perfect, and it really needs to do a lot of work. You know, I think it needs to really sort itself out on migration issues. It needs some Europe-wide. I mean, the pandemic has shown that the health thing, you know, they could be much more coordinated on health. There are areas where there are real problems, and the whole thing about Poland and Hungary, who are just abusing, you know, sort of legally, there's so many ways that they are now not living up to the treaties that they've signed up to, and yet the European Union doesn't want to do anything. You know, it seems that they're just toothless. They just don't want to sort of hold them to account, and I think that is really disappointing. So it's not perfect, but I think there is something really special about being part of that organization, that these countries are so very different, but actually in many ways, you know, everybody just wants the same thing. You know, people want to have a bit of prosperity and safety and security. And so one of the most moving things for me was, weirdly, it was the day we made our last speeches. So it must have been the 30th of January, I think. And what was it? You'll have to forgive me. I've forgotten what it was a memorial of, but I think it was a memorial. It must have been something to do with Auschwitz. So 75 years since Auschwitz had been liberated or something like that. And a woman, an Italian woman, came to speak to us in the parliament, and she had been a child in Auschwitz. And, you know, she spoke in Italian and it was translated, and it was harrowing and amazing. And after her speech, we did our Brexit speeches, and so many Germans stood up and talked about the war and said, you know, they couldn't understand why we were doing this. Why are you leaving? You know, and you spilt blood for our continent. You know, and the French were saying, you spilt blood to save us. And then the Germans would stand up and say, you know, we built this house to prevent that happening ever. I mean, it was so moving, and you never get that. You never hear about that here. You know, it's really hard for that to sort of come across somehow. And I think being on the continent and being, you know, especially when you're in Strasbourg, you're so close to the French-German border that somehow it feels much more visceral and much more real. And you can feel that for them, you know, that river just outside the window ran with blood, and they want to make sure that never happens again. And that really is part of what it's all about. And that's what we've lost, being part of that. You know, it is partly about trade, but it's about so much more than that.
And are there any benefits that you can see, potential benefits?
Oh, well, our fishermen are all going to be millionaires, aren't they? I don't know. I mean, I think the Common Agricultural Policy has lots of issues, and maybe we've got the opportunity to do something wonderful with our farming community. But, you know, then that's weighed up against a trade deal with the US, which could destroy our farming community. So I don't really see any benefits. You know, I try to be objective, but I still have yet to find a Brexiteer who can explain to me what the real benefit of all this is.
Mm. Okay, thank you. If we go back to the earlier part of your career, when you witnessed the rise of nationalism in the Balkans and the devastating impact that had on people's lives, how do you feel about the rise of nationalism that we're seeing in the UK? What do you think's caused it, and how can it be addressed?
Well, I think having been a journalist for a very long time, I think I do blame the media quite a lot. I know that in Croatia, one of the things that happened was the media kind of whipped everybody up into a frenzy. So you had very partisan newspapers and television stations in Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia, and lots of different versions of history. And I think we have the same here. People talk about having a free press. We don't have a free press. We have a press which is privately owned by millionaires who are part of a club. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think, you only need to look at the sort of geographical spread of the way people vote and how they vote and what newspapers people read to know that people sort of absorb these opinions. And I think it's only being made worse by social media. But we also have a government that is really careless in the way it talks. And I mean, I would say the same about Trump, that there isn't enough care taken about trying to be inclusive or trying to use sort of careful language. Everything is, all this nonsense about world beating this and world beating that. It's always we're better than you, and it's kind of triumphalism. And I don't know, I'm not a massive fan of the whole private school system. I do think Eton, having this cabal of people from Eton constantly in our cabinet is really dangerous, because I think that's somehow that they are raised in a different way. They talk in a different way, and I don't think that's healthy.
No, I share your views. Okay, and just going back to David Cameron's decision in 2009 to withdraw Conservative MEPs from the centre-right grouping in the EU and align them with colleagues who were further to the right, and some fairly unsavoury characters in that. How do you think that has contributed to where we are now?
Well, I don't think most people in the UK kind of know anything about that, but I think undoubtedly in Europe that would have had some influence on the way the Conservatives were thinking, because the way these groups work, they work very closely together, and they were with some very unsavory characters, and there is quite a strong anti-federalist feeling in a lot of those right-wing parties. I think that grouping was created by the Conservatives because they felt that the EPP wasn't quite right-wing enough for them, so they needed to move further to the right. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is just, people say if the EU had responded better to Cameron's demands in 2015, we might not have ended up where we were. But I don't think that was very well thought out, and I don't think there was ever any chance that the EU was going to bow down to Britain and say, oh yes, we'll give you more, because they always felt that they'd given us so much anyway. We had all the opt-outs, and we weren't in the euro, and we weren't in Schengen, and we were never really fully part of it. There was a guy called Geoffrey Van Orden who was the leader of the Conservative group when I was there. There weren't many of them. There were only a handful, and in fact, Geoffrey was the only one I ever really came across, and he was a really nasty piece of work. I met him a lot. I met him at dinners. I remember being in the lift with him one day. He was patronizing. He was arrogant. I was in a taxi with him one day when I got a phone call. I had a property on the market in Totnes, a commercial property, a result of the business that went bust. And it was kind of the last straw. I'd been trying to sell this property for about 2 years. And I got a phone call from the estate agent one morning when I was in the taxi telling me that the sale had fallen through again because of Brexit, because the guy who was buying it had just decided he did commercial property was not a good bet. And Van Orden was there in the taxi and just kind of laughed at me, and I don't know, it was just, yeah, they're just a different breed.
Yeah. Okay, moving on, I just want to talk a little bit about PR. And I know you're a strong supporter of proportional representation. And certainly in this country, first past the post has not served us well in recent years. It's, you know, we're in a terrible mess and we don't seem to be able to get out of it. And we have a very extreme government now with, you know, a relatively small proportion of the vote, but yet it's still got a huge majority.
Mm.
Given that governments in power have no incentive to introduce PR, what can be done to make it happen?
Well, I think it's twofold. I mean, I bow to Emma's much greater, deeper knowledge on this than me, but so I think part of it is that the conversation needs to be constant and it needs to be louder and it needs to be more enthusiastic, and we all need to talk about it all the time. Now, people would say that Lib Dems are completely obsessed about PR, but the way I see it is nothing's going to improve until we have an electoral system that really works. And, you know, and the parties in power didn't want to do it either. But eventually people banged on about it so much and made such a fuss that eventually the politicians had to get on board because they realized that, you know, they were out of touch and that you know, people wanted a change. Now, you know, we all say that the Labour Party is key to getting PR. The Tories will never really have to get Labour on board because they represent such a large proportion of the House of Commons. A lot of Labour members are in favour, so we need to work really hard with them to get them to persuade their party that it is a necessary thing. So Make Votes Matter is working with constituency Labour parties one by one to get them to pass motions to say that this constituency Labour Party supports fair votes. And you know, hopefully more and more and more of them will. They are coming on board. There's over 100 of them now who've done it. And eventually the idea is that they, as a big group, will put a motion forward to the Labour Party conference saying that 100, 200, 300 constituency Labour parties say we need to do this. And eventually the leadership will have to get on board. So I think it's a two-pronged thing. I think it's us, it's our leaders, it's, you know, Lib Dem, Green, SNP leaders referring to the government as a minority government. I think they need to do that far more often. I think they need to keep saying, of course, this government only represents a minority of voters. Everybody thinks that Boris has this huge majority, so therefore he has some unalienable right to do whatever he wants. But he was elected on a minority of the votes. And, you know, we need to remind people of that constantly for the next 4 years so that people remember that he only got 43% of the vote. And I don't think any of the party leaders say nearly enough about it. You know, we've had this argument in the Lib Dems. Ed Davey has said that, you know, it doesn't feel like it's the important issue amongst voters, so therefore it shouldn't sort of be top of the list of things he talks about. Well, I would disagree with that, and I would say you have to make it the most important thing that everybody is thinking and talking about, because that's the only way it's going to change. But happy to discuss that.
I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on that. Just got a couple more questions for you before I hand it over to everyone else. First one is, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about what's going to happen in the UK over the next few years?
In the short term, I feel quite pessimistic. I think it's going to be a tough winter, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better in many senses. I don't feel confident that we have a highly skilled government that really knows what it's doing. I don't really feel like they have much of a plan. I think Brexit's going to be really difficult for a lot of people. But I am really optimistic about the US election. I think if Trump is voted out next week, and it's beginning to look like that might happen, I think that's where the conversation starts changing. I think Biden will come in and will start doing good things as fast as he can. I think, you know, hopefully they will be as strong on environmental issues as he says they're going to be. That will keep the pressure up here for our government to do the same. I'd like to think Biden will possibly make his first phone call to Europe, to one of the European Union countries, and develop strong links with the European Union, so that will make people here realise that, you know, perhaps we're not the most important, and that, you know, the European Union really matters. So things like that, I think that might change the conversation. I think Johnson will go next spring, for lots of reasons. I think he hates the job. I don't think he's very good at it. Then I think we end up with a Tory Prime Minister who will be less appealing in a way to the general public than Johnson was, which can only help the opposition. But I think we all need to up our game. Everyone on the other side needs to up their game massively. And, you know, I'll only be optimistic if the Lib Dems and Labour can start having sensible conversations with each other about how they're going to get the Tories out. And I don't see that happening yet.
Yeah, and I think we all need to hope and pray for Trump to lose next week. You know, if he doesn't, it's really, God knows where we're going to end up.
Well, yeah, let's not go there.
Yeah. Okay, my last question. You've clearly got a huge amount to offer. Do you have any interest in re-entering politics?
Well, I haven't entirely left. I'm very active behind the scenes in Devon Lib Dems, doing a lot of work with our operation here to try and help get more Lib Dems elected to local government next May. I have had a sort of constant conversation with myself since January about whether I will ever stand for Westminster. That conversation is ongoing. Some days I think never ever again, and then there are days when I think, yes, I absolutely want to do this. So I don't know is the answer. Okay, well, sorry, that's not a cop-out. I really don't know.
Personally, I'd be delighted if you did stand, Caroline. So I hope that you do end that dialogue with a response that I'd like. Thank you very much.
I think the problem for me is that I know that I live in a seat that I couldn't win. And that's quite hard because, you know, I would love to fight my own seat, but I don't want to fight a seat where I kind of know that I'm going to be beaten by quite an obnoxious Tory at the end of it, and I don't want to give him the pleasure, really.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting, and I'm going to hand over to Emma now, who's going to be managing the Q&A bit of it. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Caroline. And obviously, for those that don't know, I also work at Make Votes Matter, so I'm my other hats that I wear. But thank you so much. That was really interesting. If anyone does have any questions, please just pop them in the chat, and I'll try and get through to sort of everyone's questions that they can go through. So first question that I found from David Powell. So you talked about leaders using careless language. Do you think that's done deliberately or manipulatively, or what is it? Is it sort of on purpose that this careless language has really come so much to the fore?
Oh, good question. I think sometimes it's just the way Johnson speaks. I think he's just so full of himself that he doesn't sometimes hear how he comes across. You know, he can be really crass and blunt and say stupid things, and I think he just thinks it's all a bit of a laugh sometimes. I do wonder if sometimes it's an attempt to sort of whip up the feeling of the Brexit, you know, the pro-Brexit gang. You know, it's difficult, isn't it? It's changed a bit now because of coronavirus. He's definitely not being not quite as obnoxious as he was before. I think, you know, early this year, sort of after the general election, when we were sort of heading towards the end of our time in Europe, I think he was definitely, there was a lot of jingoistic language going on, which was just that kind of triumphalism of we've won. And, you know, I think what disappointed me most was that there was never any sense from him after the general election that he actually cared about sorting it out and about trying to get the two sides to find a way of meeting in the middle. It was just all about, you know, we won, you lost, Yabu sucks kind of thing. And I felt that was very poor from a national leader, that, you know, he just really didn't seem to care that half the country had lost, and, you know, it wasn't his job to worry about it. So yeah, I think it was pretty careless. And I think, you know, maybe he's just not bright enough to realise that that's not very helpful, or maybe he really just doesn't care.
Yeah. Do you think well, it's been reported that Boris Johnson is biding his time to see what the results of the US election are going to be, to sort of decide on a path in the Brexit negotiations as were. Do you think that's accurate?
I don't know, he's cutting it a bit fine, isn't he? I mean, the results might not be through, you know, they might not be through on election night. It might take weeks. No, I think it's more that the European Union are just absolutely sticking to their red lines, which they always said they would, and they're just not prepared to budge. And if anybody's going to have to move, it's him, and he doesn't want to, because he doesn't want to look weak. And I think he's just holding out hope that if he waits long enough, the EU will say, oh, all right, then we'll give you what you want. And I really don't think they will.
Yes. While you're an MEP, did you ever get to have a reasonable conversation with a Brexit Party MEP?
Once. I ended up in, they have these cars, which you will have read about, you know, because the Brexit Party were always banging on about it, but they have a fleet of cars and drivers, which is mainly for sort of security and efficiency reasons, but they pick you up from the station and take you to Parliament and take you back for your train. So there was a Thursday when I was coming home, I got in the car, and a guy called James Wells, who was a Brexit Party MEP from South Wales, got in the car, and we talked all the way to the station. And the interesting thing was that we actually agreed on an awful lot of things. He was not one of the millionaire hedge fund managers of the Brexit Party. They were quite a diverse bunch, really. So James had just had a normal job, lived in a normal terraced house in Swansea or Cardiff or somewhere, you know, wasn't particularly wealthy, and had not, you know, obviously hadn't always been a Brexit Party. I think he said that he'd even voted Lib Dem at once in the past. So he had quite a mixed background, and he was quite a reasonable guy, and we decided when we started the conversation that we weren't going to talk about Brexit, and we got almost to the station before it kind of came up, and then it was just, you know, we were just being a bit rude to each other, really. But he was okay, and yeah, that was really funny, because he got out of the car and he grabbed his case and he left his phone on the back seat of the car. It fell out of his pocket. So I put my head in the car to get my bag out of the car, and I saw his phone there. So I obviously picked up his phone, and so I shouted at him and said, James, you've forgotten your phone. And he came back, and I handed it to him, and I said, oh, I did have a look to see if there was a passcode on it, because you know, I thought it might be interesting. And he kind of laughed and said, no, you wouldn't have got into it. And I said, oh, here you go. And he said, oh, thanks very much, that was really kind of you. I said, well, it's no problem, that's fine. And off he went. And then he tweeted later on something about me giving his phone back, and you know, what a nice thing that was for me to do. And somebody said something about, oh, I'm surprised she didn't try and get into your phone to read the messages or something. And I said, oh, well, I did try, but there was a passcode on it. And then everybody piled in, and it became this massive thing that, you know, the Lib Dem versus the Brexit Party MEP. And James and I both had to get on Twitter and say, look,
it was
actually, we were just having a laugh. He left his phone, I picked it up, I gave it back, you know, end of story, really nothing there. But I did have a really, really nasty run-in with Farage's, I would call him minder. He would say press spokesman or something, but he's an Irish guy. He's really tall. He's like 6'4" or 5 or something. And yeah, we had quite a nasty run-in outside the plenary one day when the Brexit Party MEPs were yet again being interviewed by somebody from British TV, and I made some comment about how, you know, it's a shame they can't talk to somebody sensible instead of the Brexit Party, and he started being really nasty to me, and I didn't realize who he was. So I turned around, and without thinking, I just said, oh, why don't you just F off? And he got really nasty and put his phone in my face, and right up against me and said, do you want to say that again? And I said, oh, you're going to record me then? And he was like, yeah, what did you just say? Do you? And I was absolutely quaking in my boots, but I kept really calm. And I was just like, yeah, I'm not going to say anything. And it just sort of walked off, and he was fuming. And I just thought, oh my God, these people are actually really quite nasty.
Yeah. Well, I can vouch for, I think a few of us have been out campaigning, have had camera phones thrust in their faces and had quite aggressive questioning as well, which is not comfortable. So I'm sure a few of us can sympathise with you on that one.
Yeah.
Next question from Andrew Hesselden. What can be done, if anything, to save freedom of movement after Brexit?
Don't think we can do anything really. I think we've lost it. I think that was part of the deal. There was that story last week about people being made to queue, British passport holders being made to queue at airports. Well, that's what's going to happen, isn't it? It's really sad, but I think it's gone for now. I mean, maybe over time there'll be some deal where they'll make some special arrangement with the Brits because it's affecting the Spanish holiday industry or something like that, But I think it is complicated a bit by the pandemic because we're not traveling in the numbers that we were before. So I think, the sort of effects of the loss of that is going to be slightly kind of blurred because people aren't traveling. But once travel picks up again, then maybe there'll be some deals. I don't know.
I hope so, because obviously the other part of the questions is that visas are limited to sort of 90 days really. So anyone that needs to be living and working in the EU, I don't even know what the provisions are. It might not even be clear at this stage what needs to be done.
So I have an aunt, an English aunt who's lived in France for 50 years, and her husband was American. He's dead now, but he moved to France as an American, and he lived there for 30 years, worked there. So people can go and live in Europe and work and settle. It's not like we won't be able to do it anymore. It's just going to be much more complicated, and there'll be a lot more paperwork and bureaucracy. But people from New Zealand and Australia and India and China come and live in European countries. So it's not like it won't be allowed to happen. It just won't be as easy.
Okay. On a lighter note, did you ever meet Anne Widdecombe? And is she as strange as she appears?
Yeah, she's mad. She's batty as a fruitcake. I saw during the election campaign, I saw her several times before breakfast, which was pretty grim because we had to keep going to do these radio breakfast shows, and we would sort of turn up at 7 o'clock, and she was awful. She was dreadful. She would go around with two huge minders who would sort of drive her and carry her case and drop her off places. And I mean, she's exactly as she comes across. She's a bit mad. She is very, very vocal, very strident in her views, isn't really interested in chit chat. I tried to talk to her about Strictly Come Dancing once, and she sort of brushed it off. She really didn't want to be reminded of it, I don't think.
What was that? I've just lost the question. Next, I'm going to sort of group a few on Brexit, and then we'll probably move on to PR in a second. On Brexit, do you feel the special relationship and potential deals between Spain and Gibraltar will have a wider impact?
I wasn't really expecting there to be a special deal between Spain and Gibraltar until I read that piece in the Financial Times today, which said that it looked like they might do a deal on free movement of people. Gibraltar is a really, really weird one. I mean, I did 2 visits to Gibraltar and spent a lot of time talking to the Gibraltarian government, and it's very, very strange, really. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been to Gibraltar, but they're so British and so determined to be British. And yet you know, it's this sort of dry, arid rock and the sun's shining, and for all intents and purposes you feel like you're in Spain, but there are red post boxes and fish and chip shops. You know, it's deeply weird, but they, you know, they're absolutely adamant that they won't ever be part of Spain. And you know, and you just the whole thing is a bit, I shouldn't say it's ludicrous, because I represented them, and I kind of support their self-determination, but logistically and geographically and practically it does seem a bit mad. And so I don't know how many of you know about Gibraltar's history, but there's a sort of, you know, there's a gate across the border, and Franco closed that gate, and it was closed for 17 years. So for 17 years they couldn't get anything in and out from Spain. So if they wanted to go to Spain to see, you know, lots of them had sort of family and friends who were literally just over the, you know, a few hundred meters away, they would have to take a boat to Africa and then take a boat from Africa back to Spain. So they would go via Morocco, and the food came in from Morocco, and I think it was before the airport was built. I mean, and they all remember it, you know, it's in my lifetime this happened. It's completely insane. And they said, you know, if they had to go through that again because of Brexit, then they would, and it would be worth it. And they have food airlifted in from the UK. So there didn't seem to be any sort of will on the part of the people I met to do any kind of deals with Spain to make life easier. But it looks like they might now for the workers who go back and forth. A lot of the workers go back and forth across the border every single day. So they need to do something so they don't have to do passport checks. But I'm digressing. What was the question? Do I think a deal with Gibraltar would make it
have a wider impact?
No, not really, because I think Gibraltar is such a special case. I think, you know, if Gibraltar does some kind of deal where they get freedom of movement, I think the government will brush it off. I don't think the government really cares about Gibraltar. They certainly won't let Gibraltar set a pattern for the rest of the UK.
Mm-hmm. So we couldn't all just fly to Gibraltar and then get freedom of movement straight into Spain.
Well, I know that did cross my mind, but I suppose there'll be checks, won't there? They'll
Who knows?
have to.
It's only 6 weeks away, 8 weeks away. Who knows? Another question on Brexit. It was a bit of a tricky one, actually. Were we wrong to campaign to stop Brexit? Should we have campaigned for a soft Brexit? Did our resistance contribute to the hard Brexit that we're heading towards now?
$1 million question. I don't think we were wrong to campaign for it. I think where my party went wrong was the day after the referendum, Tim Farron called for a second referendum. And I think the language around that was bad. I think if the language around that vote from day one had been about another vote to confirm the deal that is struck with Europe, I think that would have been better. And I think more people might have got behind that to say, okay, let's let the government negotiate a deal. Let's see what they can come up with. And then we'll vote on whether we all agree with that deal. Maybe it polarized opinions. Maybe the Stop Brexit thing did polarize, make people feel, you know, more inclined to support Brexit than they might have done over the years, you know, as that campaign got louder and louder. But I think we were absolutely right to stop it, and I think we'll be proven right. I think in years to come, it'll, you know, we'll be vindicated for having fought against it.
Yeah. My personal opinion, the machinations that were behind the scenes of the Vote Leave campaign and all of the pressure and data manipulation and all of that happened, I think that is probably a bigger driver to how things are going now. And I won't regret campaigning for Stop Brexit, but who knows, we can't really run it again, can we, and find out how it went if we did it a different way.
There's no control group.
No. Only. Okay, so talking about PR now, What do you think the best arguments for PR would be on the doorstep, particularly if we're talking about maybe local elections happening in May of next year and looking further ahead to the next general election, which could be in 3 or 4 years' time?
The best arguments on the doorstep. Well, I think the obvious one is to use the Green Party as a great example. You know, do you think it's right that however many % of people it is voted for the Green Party at the last election and they only got 1 seat? I think it's really useful to have a pie chart of what the House of Commons looks like and what it would look like if we had a fair voting system, so people can actually see really clearly the difference. And I think, you know, if you are in a place like, for instance, Cornwall, you know, I think you just say to people, do you think it's right that Cornwall has 6 Tory MPs and no other opinion is represented across the whole county? And that's quite hard to argue with, however you vote, even if you vote Tory. You know, it's slightly more complicated in other areas where you've got a mixed bag of MPs, but you know, it's absolutely clear cut there. And I think you could, you know, Scotland is the same, isn't it? You know, it always surprises me in a way that the SNP is so supportive of PR, because they would lose out massively. But
they take great pride in telling people that they're doing it, even though it would not benefit them. They're very proud of that fact.
Well, good for them, because you know, the Labour Party said they were behind it, and then they got into power and suddenly changed their minds. So
if you had to choose a PR system, which would you choose? Do you think the De Hont system that you were elected under is suitable? I'm sorry, I know this is not an easy question.
I'm not an expert on systems. I think the system they use in Scotland and New Zealand sounds quite good to me. You still have mixed member system. So you still have a member of parliament who represents your area, which people like, and then you have a list system to top it up so that the parties are represented properly in the parliament. That seems to me quite a good system. Although, Emma, maybe you can tell me, I've always wondered with that list system, do the ones that get added in afterwards, are they also tied to an area, or are they just sort of swilling around general MPs that don't really represent anyone?
Yes. You're testing my knowledge now, because I don't have that encyclopedia. I'm not sure that they're regionally connected, but I'm not 100% certain of that. I'm sure there may be a systems nerd on the chat that might be able to confirm that. But yeah, I think there's you elect a person to represent you as a constituency, and then there's top-ups to the party. So yeah, I don't think that they're officially sort of linked to a particular constituency, but then they obviously come from somewhere. Yeah. So there's probably.
I think they might be, because I think certainly when the Lib Dems have been recruiting candidates for the Scottish elections for next May, I think the people they're recruiting for the list, I think there is a list for each area, but I think the list area might be bigger than the constituencies. So there might be like 6 list areas in Scotland, you know, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Highlands. So there might be a list system for Cornwall or something like that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Makes sense. Yeah, but I mean, with my Make Votes Matter hat on, each country actually has its own system, although there's various sort of themes to them, and you can categorize them in certain ways. So for example, MMP, which is they use in New Zealand, there's also single transferable vote, which is used in Northern Ireland. Each country sort of tailors it to themselves. So if we had, well, when we get PR in the House of Commons, from a Make Votes Matter point of view, in the way that we think it should be sort of instigated, is that there would be a citizens' assembly that would come together to decide the system that would best suit the UK. So one of the key things that a lot of people bring up is that constituency link, to make sure that whatever PR system we have in the UK maintains that local link, and you actually have an MP that represents you, which does sort of point towards AMS or MMP, which are systems used in Scotland and New Zealand, but there would need to be some tweaking and some slight changes, because the UK, each country is individual, and you can always inspire yourself from a country, but ultimately you probably need a sort of bespoke system for each country. I hope that sort of makes sense to people. From Jane Khan, will the fact that Tory MPs are not even thinking of themselves now, they're just voting as a bloc, will annoy people and make them question why there is now no debate or questioning taking place in Parliament?
Well, I think some people just don't care, really. I think some people expect Tory MPs to toe the line, and they're quite pleased to see that that's what they do. And they, they don't like troublemakers, do they? We had a troublemaker down here, Sarah Wollaston, who actually thought for herself, and God, the local Tories hated her. I mean, you've never seen such vitriolic language on social media about somebody because she actually dared to question what her party was doing. It was appalling. So I think there's an awful lot of people who will be really pleased to see that. However, having said that, one of the things I'm working on here at the moment is most of the Devon MPs are Tories. We have a Labour MP in Exeter and a Labour MP in Plymouth, but the rest of them are all Tories. So we are now trying to do some cross-Devon media where we basically lump them all in together. And, we're saying all the Devon Tory MPs have voted for the Agri Bill, or all the Devon Tory MPs have voted for the Planning Bill, or they've all voted against free school meals for children. One of them actually was one of the 5 who broke the whip on that, surprisingly. But we're doing that deliberately to try and get people to see that they are just voting the party line, and they're not really thinking about their constituents and what might benefit them. And I think if that continues for the next couple of years, it'll be quite powerful to see that, they are just doing what they're told and really not representing the views of people who put them there. I think that can only help us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Coming back, I think I've gone through most of the questions. I don't think I've missed any as far as I can tell. Coming back to a Brexit questions. So how could we use what been phrased as developing shenanigans in Northern Ireland to keep focus on the fact that the UK does have a land border with the EU? We spoke about Gibraltar, obviously, but a lot of people have in mind that we're an island and we're completely separate from the EU, but that's not the case. And it feels like the Northern Ireland issue has really sort of dropped a bit off the agenda. How can
it does? I mean, I think it will raise its head again, won't it, in January, when goods start having to go backwards and forwards, and people then have to actually work out what it is they're supposed to do, and do they need to fill in customs forms or don't they, and will their lorries be checked in the UK or in Ireland or in the middle of the sea, or whatever crazy idea they come up with. I think there are plenty of good people in Northern Ireland who will make it an issue. I haven't heard much from the new Irish Prime Minister. Since he was since the general election, they seem to be a bit quieter. But I did hear a brilliant interview with somebody from the one of the Irish MPs on the radio, and the Today presenter said something about referred to the EU as if it was a separate body to Ireland, and the MP said, I'm going to have to stop you there, because we are the EU and we are one of the 27 members of the EU, but we are all united, and what the EU says is actually what we believe, because we agree with the EU. We are the EU. It was brilliant. And he just kept sort of coming back to that point, that you can't give us this sort of special status just because we're Ireland and just because we do a lot of business with you. We're actually part of the EU, and that's where we want to be. So I think that issue will I mean, it's complicated, isn't it? It's so complicated that I don't really understand what they're trying to do with the Irish border question. I'm not sure they understand it really. It's clear that they're
trying to pretend it doesn't exist. Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously we've heard that particularly if Joe Biden is elected as president, it sounds like there would be quite a strong pushback from the US about infringing the Good Friday Agreement. So do you think that would have like a really serious impact?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think America will be very, very vocal about the Good Friday Agreement because, you know, the Good Friday Agreement was Bill Clinton was behind that, wasn't he? So the Democratic Party feel, you know, they sort of rightly feel some ownership of the Good Friday Agreement. You know, they were part of the making it happen. And I think if the Democrats get into power in the Senate and the House of Representatives and the presidency, then they will be very vocal about us reneging on that agreement because, you know, I don't think they're going to let that happen. And that will, you know, that's seriously going to affect the UK-US trade deal, which could be fun. You know, I think that could be fun.
In a masochistic way.
Yeah.
So as a pro-EU campaign group, what do you think that we should be focusing on now? Should it be highlighting Project Fact as opposed to Project Fear, just sticking together and hoping that, or working towards there being a campaign to rejoin the EU in the future, or I don't know, building contacts with other EU countries?
Yeah, okay. So I think, quite honestly, I think a campaign to rejoin the EU is a long way off. I think we've got a lot of things to go through before that ever happens. You know, it's certainly not going to happen in the life of this government. So, you know, that's at least 4 years. And then where will we be? One of the other problems with rejoining the EU is that we don't actually meet the standards required of a future member of the EU democratically. So we don't have an elected upper house, for example. And the funding of our political parties is definitely not
transparent
enough for the EU. So, you know, we need to make real major changes here before they'd let it, you know, let's say we've completely left and time has lapsed and we are then applying to join. I think they would require us to meet some of those standards. What can we do? I think the most important thing we need to do is just be really on top of the effects of Brexit and how it is affecting our communities. So, you know, small businesses, larger businesses, anybody who is trading, who is exporting, the university, research projects, science, all that kind of stuff, manufacturing. I went to visit a dairy in, I think it was Somerset. I travelled around quite a lot last summer and got a bit confused sometimes about where I even was, but it was a dairy that exports you know, cheese to Canada. They have a huge export to Canada, and they were saying that it was going to wipe them out if there were tariffs on dairy, because the cheese would just be so expensive, nobody would want to buy it. And it was quite a reasonable sized business. You know, it was employing quite a lot of people. I think we need to really keep tabs on all of this, because the government line is going to be that these businesses go under because of coronavirus. And I think it's really important that we're clear about which jobs are being lost because of Brexit and that are not a result of the pandemic. So I don't know whether you're aware of something called West Country Bylines, which is a kind of online newspaper, which was started in Yorkshire. Yorkshire Bylines was the first one, and there are several now around the country, and a couple of people who are very involved with Devon for Europe. Oh, do you? Okay.
Yes, there's a West England one that covers our area as well.
Right. So I think, you know, our West Country Bylines is beginning to get some real traction down here and having tens of thousands of views. And they did some really strong stuff over the weekend about the free school meals. I think alternative media is really important at getting the message out about what's really going on, and just holding the government to account all the time, just constantly making people aware that, you know, this is the fault of the Conservative Party. This is what they wanted to do. This was their choice. It didn't have to be like this. You know, we could have had a very, very, very different kind of Brexit. but they chose not to do that, and so they need to, take responsibility for it.
Absolutely. This segues beautifully into a question from Jane Khan saying, why is the media so afraid of holding the Tories to account?
I think the BBC is quite scared that it'll just be obliterated, isn't it? That the Tories will, ensure that it doesn't have the funding and it can't continue. I wouldn't say that all the media is afraid of the Tories. I think quite a lot of the media is just a big fan of the Tories, and they like the idea of Brexit and they like the whole project. So why would they give them a hard time about it? The Telegraph, the Express, the Mail, they're not interested in giving them a hard time because they think it's a great idea. And that's all to do with, well, it depends how many conspiracy theories you buy into, but I definitely think there is something in this idea of people, the wealthy people who have investments, and that people will gain from Brexit, and anybody who plays on the currency markets, anybody who knows how to do fancy things with money, they're gonna get so much money out of this that they don't want it to go wrong now. They want to see it through, and they'll profit from it. So I think the BBC is a bit scared of holding them to account. I think the rest of them just love it, and I don't know if that really answers the question.
No,
I'm really disappointed in our media. I think it's dreadful, and the poor old Guardian tries its best, but it's really not up to competing with the rest of them.
A question that sort of came to mind in my mind. So you were talking a little bit earlier about the criteria for rejoining the EU, and that there are several areas where we are already sort of lacking. Do you think that our electoral system might be a sort of black mark on our account as well?
Yes, I think it probably would. I don't know the treaty well enough to know whether it actually specifies that you need to have a fair or proportional voting system for your lower house. I know that Belarus and Azerbaijan are the only countries on the European continent to share the first past the post system with us, which isn't a great advert for it, really. I don't know. Do you know, Emma, whether it's a requirement?
Well, the only reason I bring it up is because I know the Council of Europe have put out a report stating the sort of level of democracy that they expect. And they haven't outright said first past the post is bad, PR is good, but they've essentially listed out some criteria of a good electoral system. Now, obviously, this is the Council of Europe, which is separate to the European Union. And I think this only came out quite recently. So we are at Make Votes Matter, we're considering trying to sort of dig into that a little bit more and see if they could actually make a statement to say the first past the post system in the UK does not conform to what we consider to be a democratic electoral system. But that's really why it sort of came to mind, because I had seen this report from the Council of Europe.
So this might be quite a contentious thing to say. I think I'm more optimistic about us getting PR than about us getting back into the European Union.
Oh gosh, wow, yeah.
I somehow feel that it is more winnable, it's more achievable. I think there are people on all sides of the debate who can see that first past the post is wrong. And this is very contentious, but the Brexit Party supports proportional representation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't win many for Farage if it was in favour of PR, because I think, they can reach a whole demographic, a whole section of the population that we've never been able to reach. Mm-hmm. The way they do their messaging and the way they communicate with people. I mean, what they did with Brexit was really quite impressive. If they could turn that energy towards fair votes, then, you know, I think that could actually be really powerful. And, you know, one of the arguments against it is, oh, but if you have proportional representation, you would let extremists like the Brexit Party into Parliament. And the answer to that is quite simple, is, you know, they were there in the European Parliament. There were lots of extremists from left and right, you know, communists. They just made loud, shouty speeches, which were sometimes quite entertaining, and that was it, really. You know, they never managed to pass any legislation. They never managed to get enough people behind them to form a consensus, to get a majority on any of their crazy policies. So it would be the same in Westminster. They would be there and they would make a noise, but people would very quickly see that actually they don't, you know, it doesn't really serve any purpose, and it's the best way for them to sort of burn themselves out. So I think we're more likely, I think PR is likely to come first. You know, what I would like to see is a 2024 government that is a Labour government propped up by the Lib Dems and the Greens, and the SNP, and that, you know, we have a rainbow coalition which decides to push for PR. We get that, you know, that will take a couple of years. We get that through, and then we have another election under PR. So we have a completely different sort of government. And then that government, I think, probably would start looking at, right, let's try and get back into the European Union, and what do we need to do? But reform of the House of Lords is massive. I mean, let's not be under any illusion that this country, you know, those people with titles and inherited wealth and all the rest of it, they're not going to want the House of Lords to be changed anytime soon. So, you know, how we address that, God only knows.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I did have a question and I can't remember what it was. Oh yes, talking about PR and sort of allowing extremists and that sort of thing, and actually this question that's come up about nasty coalitions. So for example, we had a Tory DUP coalition in the previous Parliament. So there's a lot of evidence to show that having first past the post actually swings further to the right than governments that are elected via PR, which tend to be not biased. There'll be a mix of left and right, but there's very little sort of bias when it comes to PR. But my personal, the reason that I campaign for PR is I think that if we had PR in the UK, I don't think Brexit would have happened, because I think there would have been, it fosters this cooperation and this collaborative way of working, and there's less polarization, particularly in, well, you can see how our own House of Parliament is set up. It's two benches facing each other, two sword lengths distance, so that they can't actually kill each other if they try to. It's so antagonistic, and it's so about opposition rather than collaboration. And I guess you've obviously got experience of a collaborative parliament, which maybe is slower to move and is less radical, but at least they're less likely to kill each other.
And of course, the other thing that you gain from that is that here, you know, we're talking to the converted, but here, you know, you have a Labour government for 10 years and then the Tory government comes in. Well, the first thing the Tory government wants to do is undo some of the stuff that the Labour government did. And then, you know, that takes a few years and then they get voted out and Labour comes back in and then they want to put things back in place. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's no wonder that we don't make any progress, because we just keep going. It's like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back all the time. Whereas I think if you have a series of coalitions that kind of move like this around the centre, policies can be sort of tweaked and improved on, but it's unlikely that something would be completely, you know, ripped apart. I mean, America is a prime example, isn't it, of Trump undoing all the stuff that Obama did, and now Biden's going to get back in, and he'll spend ages probably trying to have to restore all the things he did as vice president 5 years ago. I mean, it's just, what a waste of time.
So the anti-argument to that for first past the post is that decisions get made more quickly, and that obviously with a PR it takes longer to make a decision, but at least with on the first past the post you can be decisive. So how would you counteract that argument?
Well, I think the argument has to be that, you know, that are made by governments should be properly thought through. The first, you know, when it's become apparent that what they decided to do was just not going to work. I think, you know, that sort of collaboration means that you always have somebody who is going to kind of temper the extremes and you know, hopefully have people who, you know what they're doing enough to sort of think things through and collaborate properly on developing policy. But I think you can still make policy fairly quickly if there's something obvious that needs to change and people have the will to change it. You know, we as Lib Dems are not that far apart from Labour on many issues. I think if you had a parliament that was made up of who are currently the opposition parties, I think you would have broad agreement on what you were trying to do. You might have disagreements on how to get there, but you know, I can imagine there would be decisions that would be made fairly quickly if people felt they were important enough to do that.
I don't know if you were able to get a sense for this, because obviously you only had contact with British voters, but did you get an idea that countries with PR had more engaged voters? I don't know if you had any sense of that through working with other MEPs.
Yeah, difficult to tell. I think generally there's a bit more engagement with the EU as a body amongst European voters, because I think they are more educated about the EU. You know, they're more kind of involved with it. I think Brexit has changed the argument quite a lot in the remaining 27 member states. So I had a coffee with the leader of the Danish Renew delegation just before I left, and he said, you know, we used to have quite a strong anti-EU movement in Denmark, but you know, thanks to you guys, it doesn't really exist anymore. You've killed it off. You know, our approval ratings for the EU are higher than they've ever been because people have seen just what a bloody nightmare the whole thing is, and we don't want to go there. So, you know, I think Brexit has actually been a really good thing for the EU in a way. I think it has strengthened the 27. It has made them realise that it's worth fighting for, and they want to fight for it. You know, there are still outliers. Poland and Hungary, you know, are tricky, and it is a tricky relationship, but there are enough people in those countries who want it, you know, who want to be part of the EU. And the younger generation, you know, every year as people get older, the feeling to, you know, pro-EU is stronger. So yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to know whether voters are more engaged, but I think they're certainly a bit more educated about what they get out of the EU and what it's all about.
So, someone mentioned earlier in the chat that you see a lot of school trips going through the European Parliament. Does that even exist for British schools? Do you see many British school parties going through? Well, not anymore, but did it happen?
Well, I think it did occasionally. So we had a budget to bring people over. Every MEP gets a budget. And I really struggled. In fact, I didn't take a trip to Brussels, which I felt quite guilty about, but I looked into the logistics of it. And to bring people, certainly to bring people all the way from Cornwall, it was just impossible because they would have had to be away for so many nights that it was, you know, it's such a long drive, and especially kids, you know, they'd have been away from home for several days and the budget wasn't big enough to stretch to that. So some of my colleagues from the southeast and east of England did bring groups over who came for a quick visit, but not school kids. I don't know if in the old days British MEPs took groups of school over. I mean, there was a brilliant education department, and if you came, you know, they did great little sort of lessons and lectures and tours, and it was really good fun. And we often would sit in the plenary chamber and look up. There was a gallery behind us, and you know, there would be big groups of people there, and sometimes the president of the parliament would say who was there that day, and you know, so sometimes it was teenagers who'd won a competition or who had, you know, done something very pro EU and come on a visit, and, you know, charity, you know, done something for charity or done some campaigning or something. And then there's a youth parliament which meets, I think, once a year, maybe, or once every 2 years. And each country sends kids over to have a little sort of pretend European Parliament, and they use the building in Strasbourg during the holidays. So it's really good fun. They go to Strasbourg and they go in the plenary chamber and they do a debate and all of this stuff. And I know that the Young Liberals did send some people a couple of years ago to that, but this year they weren't allowed to go.
What a shame. It's such a loss, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's coming up to 7:30, so I think it's possibly time to wrap up. But Caroline, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear sort of firsthand what life was like as an MEP, even if it was for a short period, unfortunately. But thanks so much, Caroline. Yeah. It's been really, really interesting to hear from you.
You're welcome. It was really nice to chat to you, and yeah, keep fighting the good fight. I hope I haven't been too depressing about us never getting back in. I just kind of feel like we need to be a little bit realistic, that I think it's going to be a long road. I do think we will be back in one day. You know, I don't really doubt that, but I think it'll be a while, and I think we've got more important. I really do believe that at the moment there are more important things to worry about. I think COVID is going to hit this country really badly, and I think things like you know, the economy, the job market, and mental health are going to be really, really major issues over the next couple of years, especially for our young people. It's debatable whether or not still being part of the European Union would make that journey easier. In many ways, it probably would. But I think that's where the focus is going to have to be. And, you know, we can't do anything about that, really. But you know, we need to keep our pro-EU communities together and strong, and we've all made really amazing friendships through this. I mean, for me, it's been such an amazing journey, and I think that's really important, and we need to kind of hang on to that, because there are good people, even if
Absolutely.
they're not in power.
Well, Caroline,
anyway, it's nice to chat to you all.
Set you up, because just a reminder that we have our Euro Cafe this Sunday at 2 p.m. So we have a monthly Euro Cafe where we all try and sort of stick together, have a little chat, make sure that we're all still feeling okay. And just we're going to do a little bit of bingo, nothing too challenging. We won't be deciding on the right system of PR to be used, for that was sure. But Sally has shared the link in the chat, so you can register on Zoom for that. It's this Sunday at 2 p.m. We do it monthly. The next one in December, we'll be having a Christmas party as well, so that'll be the 6th of December, which if anyone grew up in Europe is also St. Nicholas Day. So it's a very festive day, and hopefully we'll have a few little drinky poos via Zoom. But thanks again, Caroline. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you found it interesting. And please just keep an eye on the Bath for Europe Facebook group and our website for all the events and things. We've got a few other events in the pipeline, but we will be letting you know about that as soon as they're confirmed and available. So brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely evening. We've recorded this, so we'll share it on our YouTube channel as well. So keep an eye on that to be able to watch the recording if you want to watch it again. Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.